In this video, we're going to talk about some of the cycles of important biological elements, such as carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus, on the surface of the planet. Life has a great need for specific elements, trace metals and the like it can acquire through water and bits of food. But the more common elements in its construction, the carbon, the oxygen, the hydrogen, the nitrogen, the phosphorus, these are in complex cycles that interact between the surface crust of the planet, the ocean, and the atmosphere. Here's a graphic from our book that helps us kind of follow the idea of how much of each element is traveling and in what directions through what processes. These are in billion tons. So in a given year, about 100 billion tons of inorganic carbons from carbon dioxide is used up by the plants of the earth. Photosynthesis pulls CO2 out of the atmosphere, grows our plants. As plants make sugar, this can be used to make cellulose or to store for energy. While we think of plants consuming CO2 and releasing O2, that's only during the daytime. At nighttime, they consume O2 and breathe out carbon dioxide. That sugar is an energy storage for the plant, but it's also a building material. And if it's used for building material, well, the O2 released never needs to get used back up by the plant. That ends up being used by animals who eat the plant later. But in this form, it's a way that the plant can remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Some of that, however, is part of respiration. It does go back as the plants consume their own fuel at night. Fires and the like tend to free up some of it as well. Over time, plants tend to take out carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, though. But then plants die, and you get inorganic matter. Our swamps, our bogs, our fields of detritus all over will slowly break down through bacteria and fungus and free up more CO2. So rotting plant matter will eventually contribute most of that back to the atmosphere. Some of it drifts into our water supply, gets dissolved in the water supply or grows as part of plants in the water supply as well, can get out to the ocean, and in the ocean a few processes can occur. It could be used for photosynthesis by algae and the like, phytoplankton, but it can also end up as methane hydrates on the ocean floor. This is actually a big problem at the moment. There's a lot of methane hydrate on the ocean floor, which is these ice crystals of water and methane. And as the oceans are warming, that starts to break free. The equilibrium that kept it as a solid under pressure at the bottom of the ocean floor starts to break down, and we're seeing methane start to free up. We're seeing this in the permafrost in Alaska and Siberia, and we're also seeing this under the ocean in certain places towards the Arctic. This would be a problem because methane is a much worse greenhouse gas than CO2. As the planet warms, it starts to free that up. However, over time, if that's not the case, that methane hydrate through subduction and other processes tends to get cycled back into the planet, and it is actually thought to be one of the sources for fossil fuels. Contrary to the view that dead dinosaurs and the like make our gasoline, there was never really any evidence for that. Present theory is much more towards the idea that the planet naturally produces oil as part of the cycling process. As it pulls in materials from the subduction, you have a lot of carbon molecules that can be compressed into bigger carbon molecules to reduce their pressure, and that's a favorable process. And so we take these methanes and other short hydrocarbons and we turn them into oil, or at least the planet does. Humans then harness this, burn it, and contribute CO2 back to the system. So carbon has a large, complex system of exchange back and forth. Presently, our extra addition of CO2 is disrupting this equilibrium just a little. As we've seen with equilibrium calculations, as you start to increase one side, you start to affect the others. And we are definitely starting to increase the amount of CO2 while reducing the amount of photosynthesis as we clear out old forests and prevent new ones from growing. Our farmland is a brief cycle because any CO2 removed, we just reintroduce when we consume the food. And so unless we have a storage in the plant life, it isn't meaningfully removing that carbon dioxide. Nitrogen is another gaseous component. It's actually a little bit harder to break out of the atmosphere, however. CO2, life is really good at doing that, but not all life can actually harvest nitrogen. N2 is a triple bond. It is very strong. A few organisms have figured out enzymes that can break N2 apart, and they are some of the most researched organisms on the planet because we are desperate to figure out how they do it so efficiently. Most human ammonia production, which is how we use nitrogen to fertilize our farmlands and the like, tends to end up using fossil fuel materials and other things. The ability to use just nitrogen and water would be amazing for our production. It does lead to some problems, however. Usually some plants that have the little bacterial nodes that can fix nitrogen would grow, and then other plants near them would benefit from that. And there was a diversity of some plants that could produce nitrogen, some that couldn't, do their symbiotic bacteria or not. And this was in fairly good homeostasis. Then humans came along, cleared the fields, dropped one particular type of plant that tended to need nitrogen, and the fields died. We let our farmlands go fallow at times because they just stopped producing well. We need to let them regenerate. Over time, lightning in the atmosphere and things like that can cause some of the N2 to react with oxygen, make some nitrates, nitric acids, and the like. These can then rain down, get into the soil, and start replenishing the soil. Various bacteria and organisms in the soil will turn this into usable nitrogen forms, and then plants can regrow there. At the rate we use our farmland, however, this has not been particularly effective, and so we needed extra nitrogen. We needed to replenish the soil through fertilizers. Humans have been producing about 36 billion tons of ammonia each year, which we dump into our farmlands, and unfortunately, we're not very good at it. We just spray it all down, it tends to wash off, it gets into the water layers, this causes algae blooms, as you suddenly have a massive increase in the amount of available nitrogen and its various compounds for the plant life right in our estuaries and right off our shores. These algae blooms also tend to deplete the ocean of oxygen, causing fish to die and other organisms as they rapidly grow. Or it can be varieties that are toxic that cause red tides and the like, making various shellfish inedible and killing various fish species. And so the extra nitrogen that we are adding is actually a rather significant amount, at least in the regions where humans live. In terms of the natural processes without humans, we tend to have a little bit fixed by life. We get some nitrates in our soil. These can stay compressed for a great deal of time. There's plenty of nitrate material and rocks composed of it throughout the planet. These can also break up at times. And nitrates tend to be fairly soluble. So if exposed to water, they tend to dissolve, and there's a great deal of dissolved nitrogen in our ocean. Life itself tends to cycle it in the form of urea. As we break down proteins, we tend to produce ammonia. An amino acid has a nitrogen. It goes to a carbon with double bond oxygen and OH, and other various components on it. As we break down proteins, we tend to free up some nitrogen. And so our body produces urea to help us remove that ammonia from our system. That urea can be processed by various microorganisms back into nitrates and nitrites, which can just go back into the cycle. So life had developed a reasonably good system of back and forth exchange with the land when it wasn't being used for a monopurpose. However, our present farming system most definitely is draining the soil in various places and causing problems that we are exacerbating by adding outside sources of nitrogen. And the third extremely important element for life is phosphorus. Phosphorus is used in all of our DNA backbone. It's used in many, many processes within our body to drive our energy production. If you want to aerobically break down sugars and the like into ATP, well, adenosine triphosphate has 3 phosphates as part of it. If you're anaerobically breaking down a sugar, we still use phosphate to initiate the breakdown processes. Phosphate is used in all sorts of biological transfer events, and so we need a lot of phosphorus. And life has used most available phosphorus. There's not a lot of stores of phosphorus anywhere that life hasn't made use of because of how important it is. Unfortunately, it doesn't have a gaseous form, and this makes the phosphorus cycle immensely slower than the carbon and nitrogen cycle. Leaving a field fallow for a couple of cycles would allow the field to grow food again, and so farmers would leave part of it without crops as they just let that restore. Phosphorus, this is not going to happen. Eons are needed for the phosphorus cycle in most cases. Well, phosphate rocks are largely insoluble, and so very little phosphates tend to dissolve. But a little bit over time does. Life is good at taking it, putting it somewhere, and as a result, the equilibrium favors more to dissolve. And so bit by bit, you can get phosphate rocks to dissolve and be exploited by life. In general, however, it just stays within the land-based biological cycles. Something eats a plant, gets the phosphorus from that plant, that animal then poops that out. As it's done with it, some other plant seed can come along and harness it from the material, as it doesn't tend to flow away the way a nitrogen would because, well, it's a phosphate. It's not particularly soluble. So land-based cycles will eventually lose a little bit to water streams, but rocks break down over time. As you get more and more phosphates building up in the local aqueous environments, they'll plate out on the bottom. Over time, up thrusts from plate tectonics will re-expose those rocks. New phosphate rocks will then become accessible, and life can make use of it. But this does require geological time frames for those sedimented phosphates to be re-exposed and reutilized. This is actually one of the largest problems for our farming at the moment. We're also throwing lots of phosphorus into our farmlands to deal with the fact that we farm in one part of the world, send it hundreds of miles away to be eaten, and then flushed down a sewer back out to the estuaries. We are quickly dephosphorizing all of our farmlands. There are phosphate mines, but most of those came from biological concentrations from the ancient pasts. Inland seas that dried out and all the life piled up and the phosphates in it crystallized. Today, most of those reserves are in Morocco, and we think we only have 200 to 300 years of those reserves before we're out of phosphate fertilizer. So fixing our loss component to the ocean, or finding new sources that we can harvest, is a rather important thing for the future of humanity. It is part of this cycle that we are rapidly disrupting, and there is no quick way to fix it without massively changing how we're engaging in the process. So here's just a quick overview of the types of things we think about for what happens to the elements. They're not just sitting there waiting to do something forever. They're not mysteriously showing up out of nowhere as life needs it. There's a lot of processes moving various elements around the planet constantly. What these are, how we disrupt them, the consequences of that disruption is a large part of the modern world and will continue to be so for as long as humanity is existing on the surface of this planet.